Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Dean, Seattle Opera Dramaturg, and excited to welcome our guests on Zoom, and our panelists here to our very special night. Thank you all for joining us on this wonderful Seattle, lovely December night here at Seattle Opera at the Center. We are gathered on the homeland, the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people. We acknowledge this as a reminder to strive for respectful relationships as we work with all people together towards reconciliation and healing. And I'm our moderator this evening with our creative team for Seattle Opera's brand new production of Orfeo and Eurydice, coming to you in this very room in January. More performances than we've ever given of anything, because those of you on Zoom might not be able to see, but it's a very small room. It's going to be a very, very intimate, up-close, a new kind of experience for Seattle Opera, doing a chamber opera presentation. And Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice really is a neat piece to try something new with, because it's the kind of oldest opera that's continuously been in the repertoire. They've never not done this opera since its premiere in 1762. In fact, 100 years later, 1850s, let's say, 90 years later, Richard Wagner, opera composer who's we're all fond of here at Seattle Opera, made a big public statement that the problem with opera is the means have become the end, the ends have become the means. It should be about story, it ends up being about music and singers showing off. Well, Wagner was just recapitulating what Gluck had said, and Gluck and his librettist, Ranieri di Calzabigi, who changed opera up in the 1760s with this piece. So really, Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice is Wagner's vision of the absolute, total, complete work of art, what he called the Gesamtkunstwerk, or you gather all of the different art forms and put them together. That long-winded preamble from me is my way of saying we've got here a director, a conductor, and a choreographer, because this is a collected work of art. And there's a lot that goes into it. Let me quickly introduce our fantastic creative artists team for this production, and then we'll get to talking with them about what's happening in this particular show. Donald Byrd is our choreographer. Donald Byrd is the artistic director of Spectrum Dance, has been since he moved to Seattle, some 20 years ago. I don't think you weren't the founding general director of Spectrum, but
no, that was Dale Merrill.
Dale Merrill, but you've been with them ever since.
Yes.
You made his Seattle Opera debut in 2007, has been with us several times since then, also works a lot with P&B and on Broadway, and fantastic, and it's wonderful to have you back. For some reason, anytime we do a Baroque opera at Seattle Opera, Donald Byrd somehow ends up getting involved. Making her Seattle Opera debut, director Chía Patiño. We're very excited to welcome you here to Seattle for the first time, Chía, and we've stolen her away to the dark, cloudy Northwest from her current home in Texas, where she's in charge of the Butler Opera Center of the University of Texas in Austin, but before that was running the National Theater in Ecuador, which is where you're from originally. Yep. And Chía got to know Christina Scheppelmann, Seattle Opera's general director, back in Washington, D.C. But a very, very, an artist who I think, in the words of Christina Scheppelmann, oozes creativity and has been known to sort of mix it up a little bit. For instance, the Flauta Magica de los Andes, which was magic flute reconceived for the Andes, and I think even reorchestrated with some local instruments.
Completely reorchestrated.
Completely reorchestrated. And going on after our Orpheus here, a very exciting opportunity for Chía coming up in Ópera de Tenerife in the Canary Islands with an opera that we love here, Florencia en el Amazonas. Mexican language, or Mexican opera sung in Spanish, going to Spain for the first time, and you're going to be the director of that next spring.
It's the Spanish premiere, for Spain.
It's been performed in Latin America, kind of up and down.
No, actually in Latin America, only in Mexico.
Just in Mexico, but not, I thought it was, So anyways, Florencia, which started, Seattle was one of the co-commissioners of that opera. Oh. So we've done it twice. Yeah, so anyways, I was excited.
But you haven't seen mine. You're welcome to come to Tenerife.
That sounds like a really nice thing to do mid-spring. Over here in his position where he'll be in the show, our maestro, Stephen Stubbs. Stephen Stubbs is a great son of Seattle, grew up in Seattle, deep connections with the University of Washington as a student and as a professor, and did a lot of operas there. But Stephen Stubbs is known in the world of early music in particular for decades in the sort of Northern Europe capital. I think Bremen was your home for a lot of years, and it's Seattle Opera for a lot of reasons. We don't tend to go back too much further behind Mozart, but I think Mozart is kind of where you stop, the other end. Yes. But anyways, came back to Seattle in 2007, artistic director of Pacific Music Works, which many of you know, and is going strong and has some exciting programming coming up. Stephen Stubbs, you've also been with Seattle Opera going back to that 2007 Julius Caesar.
Exactly, that was the first time.
And we're very excited, in this case, to have you at the helm. You may have seen Stephen Stubbs in Baroque operas at Seattle in the past with the theorbo, which is this kind of thing that looks like a lute married a giraffe.
Yes.
Sticking up there. But in this case, are you playing in this, Orpheus?
We haven't decided yet. I've got some instruments with me, so it's possible.
So we might see you. So early music works quite differently. It can be a lot more flexible. Decisions are getting made a little bit more spontaneously, wouldn't you say, than sometimes happens. So let me start. Actually, I've got some questions for all of our panelists here. Donald Byrd, you've done lots of shows about contemporary issues. The last time you were with Seattle Opera, actually, Charlie Parker's Yardbird, the choreographic element, which many of you will remember, was about heroin addiction and racism and lots of sort of juicy subjects of today. And yet we also have seen you do these sort of fanciful shows of long ago and far away, the dancing nymphs in Semele, or the Egyptians versus the Romans in your recent Julius Caesar that you just did for Atlanta. Is it the same thing? I mean, how do you, when you're, compare the last thing you worked on here, Charlie Parker's Yardbird, as a work of art, the audience has a totally different relationship with that, I would imagine, than they do with something like Orpheus and Eurydice, which is a real stretch for the viewer. Or is that not, how do you
how do I negotiate?
Yeah, or how do you separate art from entertainment?
I think I don't. I think that I don't. I mean, it is a kind of entertainment, but it is also, I think it's art primarily. I do entertainment, you know, like Broadway things, but, you know, I'm a little mercenary when I do that because it's really about the money in some ways. But it's also, I only do those kind of projects that also are pushing what that is. So when I did The Color Purple on Broadway, I was really interested. I was only interested in it because the subject matter was not your typical Broadway subject matter. And so I go, oh, well, let's see how they're going to do this. And so I was happy to kind of be involved with it. With opera, one of the things I like about doing opera is that the relationship with the director. I think it's really important. I mean, for me, that and I think it's in all collaboration that you respect your collaborators, but also there's something about the collaborator and especially the director, it kind of sparks your imagination and kind of that you are delighted by. And so, like Chía, I find really she's very imaginative, and so in her imagination goes in directions that I wouldn't expect, and so that stimulates me, and so I find myself wanting to return to opera because of the stimulation of the director. If the director is interesting and kind of, excuse me, I don't mean it in a negative, kind of crazy, you know, then it's really fun. You know, it's really fun.
The sparks.
The collaboration. And so I like being challenged that way, so it doesn't matter if it's a Baroque opera or it's a contemporary opera or a contemporary ballet or whatever.
And the idea of the work in progress. You're not coming into the process knowing all of the moves.
No.
At this point, you're just going to sort of figure it out.
Yeah,
as we go.
It's, you know, it's a kind of improvisation. You know, like you don't want Yuri Killian, who for years is a kind of internationally well-known choreographer and was the founder of Netherlands Dance Theater. He wasn't the founder. He was like probably the most famous director of the Netherlands Dance Theater. And I read something once where he said, well, I have some ideas, but I walk in the room and look to see who's in front of me. And so it's a little bit like that. I mean, I hear what the director says and say, this is what I'm after, this is what I want. And then I kind of have to wait to see before I start making any kind of concrete decisions.
What that's actually going
to be.
Turn into in reality.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen Stubbs, it sounds like there's a similar kind of thing going on in terms of your orchestration here, where you brought some instruments and we'll sort of test them out. My question of you actually is, if you would talk to us about, you played McCaw Hall. We saw you with the theorbo in there. That seats 2,800.
Yeah.
I think we're capping. Actually, I don't know the total number, but it's got to be around 150 will be the maximum we can get in this room. Is it the same job? It's such a completely different space, making music for these two different opera containers.
For me, the smaller space feels more like home for a piece like this. And all the pieces that I do, really, Baroque operas before Gluck, really benefit from a smaller space where you can be intimate and where there's a feeling of connection to the audience that's increased by the small space. But most importantly to me, it increases the ability to have the dynamic range be completely at your disposal. You can go down to pianissimo. It's not just because it's got good acoustics, but because it's a small acoustic that you can go down to pianissimo without fear of being lost in the audience. And that's tremendously important because I feel like composers, and Gluck certainly, was very interested in all the dynamic shades that could be attained by the singers. And here, as we work, we're really working with the idea that they can sing as loud or soft as they like. There's no sort of bottom to the production, which frankly there is in a bigger hall, right? There's a certain place you don't go below.
Well, I know when we've done those Baroque orchestras for the Handel operas that we've performed over there, they bring, it's on hydraulics, the orchestra pit, and they bring it up so it's closer to the audience, because some of those instruments just don't produce quite so much sound.
Well, and that also corresponds to the historical situation. The orchestra was on the floor; they weren't in a pit. And so, I mean, sometimes there was a slight pit. I've been in some 18th century. There's some beautiful, still existing 18th century houses like Český Krumlov and Drottningholm, which I've had the luck to be in and play in. And there's a slight depression, but it's not like they're way down in hell. They're right there, and that also makes the connection, the oral connection with the singers and with the audience, more direct.
Chía Patiño, question for you. Our Seattle Opera season continues here. We just did La Bohème, and now here comes Orpheus and Eurydice. And it did strike me that the curtain went down on, husband or wannabe husband weeping at the deathbed of his beloved, who's just passed away. And that's where we're going to be when we go up on this one. However, from the point of view of an opera company, doing La Bohème is not even remotely like doing Orpheus and Eurydice. For one thing, La Bohème comes off the shelf and you do exactly what's on the page, and Puccini, like all of those later composers, major micromanager who tells you exactly how to do everything, and on this note, when the harp does that plink, you have to go like this with your stage gesture. Orpheus and Eurydice, we kind of get to make up our own a little bit. This is an opera that actually does, there is a critical edition, but it's scalable. It's been done continuously since 1762. It's been done, even the composer did it several different ways, changed keys, moved stuff around, different voice types, and we're adjusting. Our version that we're doing here is totally different from any version of this opera Seattle Opera has ever presented before. And I was hoping you might talk a little bit about what strikes you as a director working with a piece. Do you like working with the pieces where this is what it is and you're stuck, or here, this is a piece that actually requires us to complete it?
I don't think that if you keep your ears open, a piece is ever stuck. If the composer is good, I think every single signal in the score gives you the interpretation of the composer. And then if you read the text carefully, then you also can debate what they wanted to say. But just like any poem, you can read and have 2 or 3 different interpretations. A director, a music director, a choreographer, a set designer, our multimedia designers, each one will have their own interpretation. So what I find is, for me, is important. I trained as a composer. So I very close examined, because I wrote an opera, and I remember thinking a minute before I decided this needs to have an accent. You know, those things don't happen by I'm trying to say what I wanted. Mm-hmm. But also composers, they're more flexible than we think. I think it's a mistake when we put a piece in a museum, because the composer Mozart would be the first one to say, that works better, change it. You know, I really honestly believe that any composer would always choose the way it works better under that circumstance. In this theater, that sounds too loud, cut it. You know, in this theater, that sounds too soft, double it. You know, I think any composer would do that. So I myself think whatever it takes so that the piece takes life and talks to the audience in the best way possible, respecting the score and the story and the audience. I don't think you can go wrong with that. And then the piece takes, because the audience is the third element we tend to forget. You know, you have the performers, you have the creators, and you have the audience. If the audience is receptive, that becomes also part of this. So a piece cannot be stuck just by the fact that it's always circulating between a lot of live people. So I don't, and yes, I mean, you have, like in orchestra, Mahler tells you to death here is a pianissimo, but he's not here.
Will you tell us a little bit about, of course I want to talk about some of the specifics of this Orpheus and Eurydice, but tell us a little bit about what happened with this magic flute. It was done in Spanish?
Yeah, and it was the situation. With the National Theater in Ecuador, we don't have a symphonic orchestra, but we have an Andean orchestra instrument. Orquesta Instrumentos Andinos, Orchestra of Andean Instruments, sorry. And everything that the orchestra plays is written by them, for them, because nobody else is writing anything for them. So there's a lot of adaptations. And Baroque music works fantastical. You have all the quenas, zampoñas, all the winds are fantastic for that. And because that's the orchestra I had, we decided, well, let's use that one. And then at some point I realized, I started translating to Spanish, and then I thought, why are we not using the whole Andean cosmovision? If it's gonna sound Andean, it's gonna sound in Spanish, and so the story became the indigenous people, which actually, and I was talking to Steve about that, they're way closer to what Mozart. So the Indians still believe in pantheism, and the Queen of the Night, for them, it exists. And the Sarastro, the sun, for them, it exists. And the relationship to the snake, the relationship to everything that happens, for the Indians, it was amazing. That for them, it was like, okay, yeah, it was, for us, it's a fantasy story. For them, it's a real story. And because we had commissioned the costumes from the indigenous people, half of the theater was indigenous, and they didn't know that it was an opera, so they didn't know they were supposed to be formal, and we had a lot of puppets. We had over 100 puppets in that show, because we have a small chorus, and we tripled the chorus by giving them 2 more people. So then suddenly 20 people became 60. It was like, it's supposed to look imposing, but and once you put all the puppets, all the kids, they don't know how to behave. And it was the best audience, because they're talking straight to Papageno. They were screaming, they were laughing. It was a completely chaotic scene. And I loved it, you know. So who's there to say what's opera? I think we think, or not we, a lot of people think that it's supposed to be serious. It's supposed to be about feelings, and feelings are not under control. You know, they're just not. You feel like laughing, you're gonna laugh. And that the composer would love. I was once looking at a Rossini, and the staging, it was Malcolm Fraser, was so incredibly funny. I was just laughing, and it was funny. And this lady in front of me goes, shh, And I was like, but it's funny. It's like, what do you want me to do? It's like, I'm sure that, and then it became so ridiculous, like the whole audience started laughing because they had built the pool and it was this bouncing head on the stage. You know? How can that not be funny?
Well, I mean, Rossini, best sense of humor in all
But
of
many
opera,
people will do it like, shh, this is opera. We're supposed to behave serious. It's like, I'm just never being serious. I seriously tried, but I failed plenty of times.
I want to interject something. What you're describing very much is like how the theater operates in African American communities and even the tradition of African American music of call and response, that there's this relationship between what goes on and then the audience responds. Like if you go to a black show, and then the audience talks back to the stage sometimes, or they're very responsive to something. If they like it, they respond immediately. They're not inhibited by how they're supposed to behave, because they don't know how they're supposed to behave. They know they respond to what's in front of them, and I think that's really that can be really, really exciting. And I think Western audiences in the past have really been raucous in the theater. And so I don't know when it shifted about being well-behaved, but there were some rowdy people in the theater back in the past in European theaters and even in early American theaters.
Yeah. And what you were talking about the kids talking back to Papageno, I'm sure that Schikaneder, the original Papageno, he was a popular actor. I'm sure he had the audience talking back to him too.
Yeah.
So
that was how it was designed
absolutely.
to be that interactive and that alive.
Yeah.
Stephen, you've played in a lot of these theaters in Europe, and certainly in the opera world, the singers are sort of legend of those really nasty audiences in Italy, where if you come out and you try the thing and you're not going to make the cut, they'll let you know how they feel. Whereas we do, at least in this country, have this very well-behaved. The audience comes to an opera a lot of the time wanting to be proper, wanting to behave, and it unfortunately can get in the way of with how the experience was originally designed, which is to have a little bit more life or freedom. So let's go ahead and talk about Orpheus. Now, Chía, you mentioned it's about feelings.
I loved when they asked me for this title, and scarily enough, it was that we've been living this for the last 2 years on how do we deal with death, and people more or less closer or farther, but it just feels that death has been dancing on top of this planet. And I don't think I know anybody that hasn't experienced death these last 2 years, and if there is, lucky for them. But it also became too obvious that we've dealt with that so much that it was not a story about death, it's a story about love, and how do we understand that sometimes, and I talked in this before, sometimes in particular, we're talking COVID, I had a friend that he was in such bad shape, like respirator, that all his organs were shot. And so, but you're still praying, even though I hadn't prayed for I don't know how many years, and yet. And at some point I thought, like, why are we so selfish that we want them here? Like, his liver was shot, his eyes were shot, his kidney was shot. So his life would have been miserable. So we can be so selfish that we want somebody to live when it's their time to die. And I think there is a big lesson there. And I needed to make peace with that, to the fact that sometimes it's the time for people to go. And that's also what I find, because otherwise Orfeo, I can think is like we idealize Orfeo, and Orfeo talks many times of Eurydice as an object. And Eurydice usually doesn't have a voice. In Monteverdi, she has no voice.
Very small, very small.
And it's gone.
Yeah.
Here, at least she gets an aria, And so it's interesting that we never see what she's feeling, and we have to see what she's feeling through Orfeo. And for me, it was very important that Orfeo loves her the way she needs to be loved and not the way he needs to love her. So that's kind of the way we've been turning the story around, is like how Orfeo is a better lover by letting her die, if that makes sense.
You know, one of the things one of the first, maybe the first production meeting that we had with Chía, that was the thing that struck me, and that was this idea of letting somebody go that you love and not being selfish. And I was so moved by it, and that you know, normally at a first production meeting, you're just kind of like hearing some stuff, and you go, okay, all right, blah, blah, blah. But this was so, I thought, profound a way to think about it, you know, and also framing it the way she has in terms of, you know, that wanting in some ways to remedy something, that Eurydice has no voice, and to actually give her voice, that it's important, and especially in the times that we live in now, like around the voice of women, to the women, and to kind of bring that out in this piece without imposing something, but actually in some ways being true to the spirit of it. I think it's really interesting also, another point about in ballet, like Balanchine's Orpheus, for example, you know, Balanchine was notorious for objectifying the ballerina and the woman. So it's always about what she looked like, and not about, you just so everything to me. And but we don't know what she's thinking. We don't even get a glimpse of it. Even in the whole ballet, it's all about him obsessing over her. Mm-hmm. So I think Chia's point, I think, is really well taken in the sense that's also part of the one might say the history of opera and of the myth, is that she is always an object, mm-hmm. and so it is always told from his point of view. I mean, I think maybe the one exception might be Black Orpheus, where we get a sense of who she is in that film. But
well, let's throw this one over to Stephen Stubbs. Stephen, you've probably worked on more Orpheus operas than anybody else on the planet, because it's that subject that they started opera. This was the first opera ever, or the Eurydice. I was going to say, actually, most of them are called Orpheus. Mm-hmm. This one is called Orpheus and Eurydice.
Right.
Do you know of any other Orpheus opera where she gets, I mean, because she does have a fair amount to sing in this. She sings a duet with him, she sings her own aria.
Oh yeah, in several of the ones that I've done and know, she has a bigger voice. But yeah, for instance, the Luigi Rossi Orfeo, I'd say Eurydice gets about 50-50 with Orfeo. So yeah, it's not unusual. And in fact, there's one I was telling you about, which is kind of like the next chapter after Monteverdi's Orfeo, which is called La Morte d'Orfeo by Stefano Landi, just about 10 years after. And in that one, it's really like the next chapter. So he's been through what goes on in the normal Orfeo story. He's been to hell and got her, but lost her again. So he's back on Earth, and it's his birthday. And he declares that the only thing he wishes is that there be no Bacchus and no women, which of course drives Bacchus and all the women mad, and then they become the Menadi and go after him. So it's a different thing. But in that one, he dies a second time because they rip him to bits. He goes to hell a second time and finds Eurydice again, but she's been there too long, and she thinks, who's this crazy man talking about love? I have no idea who you are. So it's a really kind of modernistic take on the whole thing. Huh. But when Chía told me that when we first started discussing this, what she told me right away was that she really didn't want Amore to come back at the end and save the day. She wanted the whole thing to be worked out between Orfeo and Eurydice. And strangely enough, because her background is in composition, and so is mine, that was my education as well, we were immediately on the same page. It's like we completely respect what Gluck did, and it's an absolute masterpiece. We're not touching the basic torso of the piece, but the sort of stupid happy ending we didn't need, and so we just cut that and replaced it with something really beautiful and a kind of surprise for the audience when we get there.
that Deus Ex Machina happy ending was sort of obligatory.
Yeah.
I think there's a letter between Gluck and Calzabigi or something where they're like, we have to,
we have
because
to.
it was like so-and-so's birthday when they were doing, or the name day, I think, of the emperor, when they first gave the
It
premiere.
wasn't the original
it
ending.
had to have a happy ending, even if that doesn't really make any sense and isn't in the same world of feeling that we've been in,
Exactly.
with this extremely profound, but very touching, very real, very human music all the way through. And I wonder if I could get you guys to sort of walk us through the different stages, because it's a very short opera. It's only, it's a little over an hour. We're not going to take an intermission. And yet, so much happens in it, and we go on such an extraordinary journey. I wonder if we could, starting there with that sort of funeral music, that I don't know if it's a tombeau scene.
Well, actually, that's the other thing we did, was we chopped the overture.
Oh, it starts with a chipper little overture.
There's an overture that has literally nothing to do with the piece. It's just like happy music, and then you go to the funeral. so we just dove right in. So we just start right in that funereal atmosphere of the chorus and Orfeo at the grave of Eurydice screaming her name. And it's a really emotionally fraught moment, and we don't get any prelude to it. We just go right there. I think
We're in there, in medias res, and there are opera singers and dancers on stage when the lights come up.
It has to do with practicality, and when we first started talking about this, again, we're living COVID times where some restrictions like time might be an issue, so it was conceived as like, let's do it shorter because of the space. And so we decided not needed the beginning, not needed that, and that helped with the time. The chorus is going to be this presence, but not on stage. And you can't run away. We need furies. And we do start with a dead body on stage that needs to be taken out without levitating.
Practicalities.
Those little things, and it works out. So we go straight into the obscure, recondito and obscure place where Orfeo is. Amore comes in. The second act is with debate between the furies. We're one of the things I'm looking forward is the way of multimedia. I've never been in love with multimedia as a background. Instead, I'm very much a 3D kind of person. But I had the pleasure to meet Katie Tucker, who's our multimedia in a show I did for Houston Grand Opera, and she's brilliant. So when the multimedia helps the storytelling, and right now we're taking some chances, which I'm not gonna explain, because I'm really curious how they're gonna work on breaking the sense of gravity and reality by combining live people in multimedia. So we're experimenting a lot, and we'll find out how much it works. But because you do have all of the second act is these haters. I mean, you are somewhere under, over, you're not in the planet. You have crossed over to wherever it is.
There's a real threshold crossing and a kind of hero's journey pattern to this whole story, that he has to go into the dark space. Somehow,
but he's not a hero.
But he's not a hero, right?
No.
But he invades where the heroes go. And in any case, how do you create a place where it feels like the underworld? And so we're using the dancers and the multimedia and the music and the text and just the motions itself. The set is also very beautiful, what Carrie came with it. So and then the third one, it's they almost made it, and then we didn't. But then it just has to. That's where we have to find peace, and there is a transition. I don't want to give too much so that it is a beautiful. I think
we'll leave them with some surprise in there, and we should call out the other members of our creative team who aren't here. Katie Tucker, who's designing the projections and these multimedia elements. Carrie Wong, our set designer, who's another satellite, and Robert Aguileras, our lighting designer. Donald
and Robert doing the other Robert. Robert starts with a W.
Our sound designer.
Robertson Whitmer, who's going to be doing sound actually and extending it out into the entrance space as well, so the experience will be really immersive. Oh, and Liesl Gacheko, our costume designer. So there's actually, we've got 3 fantastic artists here, but there's even more artists on this creative team getting going. Actually, I wanted to flip back over to Donald, and as I mentioned, when we get into that, even in that first scene, we have dancers on stage, we have singers. The singers are dancing. I don't think the dancers are going to sing.
Could happen.
It's very improvisatory.
It's always time, right? It's always time.
I mean, but tell us
We
a
have
little
2
bit
weeks.
about what that's. Have you done that before? Staged dances on opera singers?
Yeah, I have. Ava and Julia Caesar, remember, she requested a solo.
Ava Podlesh is Julia Caesar.
Yeah,
in
so she
2000,
requested a solo, so I had to make a solo dance for her. And, but have I done, yes, I think some. I mean, mostly movement. I think some of this actually looks like dance with the 2 singers, and it's based on the tango. Chía said, you know, I have this idea that the tango is happening, which is in 4, is happening on top of this 3, and so that will create a kind of interesting dynamic. But also, there's so much about the tango is sensuous, you know, and so that we actually get to see in I think how their love manifests itself in a kind of physicality without being kind of overly explicit. But Chía did say, and I think also in her presentation the other day, it was love and lust, that somehow that in this context that like where love is and where lust is kind of like where maybe is there distinction in this particular case or not. And so I think one of the things there's a lustfulness about tango. And so I think that's part, of what we're
Well, and there's that sensuality that you're talking about is absolutely there in every single note of Gluck's score.
Right.
It is
Absolutely.
It's just seething with this sort of intense passion. And then, I mean, the scene, on the return journey, you know, it's a there and back again. And as everybody probably knows the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, back again doesn't really work out the way it was planned. And it has to do with this question of sex. I mean, I guess, although it's the 18th century Italian kind of poetic language for it is the gaze. Why aren't you looking at me?
Right.
And so, without maybe going too much into the details, let me ask you guys, what's so important about the look? Why not look?
Oh, why can't he look back?
Yeah, what is that? I mean, it's just a plot point. In these stories from the antique world, sometimes these prohibition. Now, don't you eat the apples from that tree?
Right.
In this case,
And Eve did it.
and of course, you always do exactly what they just forbade you to do.
Right.
But what is that? Why is that in this?
Well, that creates the whole third act, essentially. I mean, the first act is the funeral. The second act is going to hell. Both the Furies aspect of hell, but also the Elysian Fields, they're both painted so sublimely by Gluck as it's just such powerful, direct music. Like this is hellish music. This is sublime. You're in heaven forever music, and there's just no question about it. I mean, they are what they are, and they're gorgeous. Then you enter into the third act, and suddenly you're in this struggle. He's trying to lead her back to the world, and she's going, why aren't you talking to me? Why aren't you looking at me? What's going on? And so that creates a tension, which Gluck pulls out into this enormously long scene of great tension and great complicated notation from him about the way the orchestra follows their every emotion and every feeling. So that's what we've been working on just in our first couple of days of rehearsal here. And we have fantastic singers who are so ready to absorb that, that detail. And I'm very enthusiastic about that. And again, here the small space is going to allow that detail to really tell. So usually you look at the third act of Gluck's Orfeo and with great fear and trepidation because it's hard to make the orchestra go with the singers. But here we have really talented singers, and I've got an orchestra leader who's going to actually attend some of the staging rehearsals, and that's magic from my point of view.
Yeah, Stephen, tell us a little bit about how this orchestra is going to work. They're all going to be with you right here in
Right.
the playing space,
Right.
including Valerie Mussolini, our harp
Yes.
soloist, principal harp Seattle Symphony, and she, of course, is somehow Orpheus.
She's Orpheus,
doing the lyre because he's always in all the paintings. He's always got
when,
his,
when he comes on, he's got the lyre. When he comes into hell, he's got the lyre, and so it's clear
the
that's-
Furies scene is kind of
him.
the harp versus the what is it the lower strings or the
and
Donald, you have some dancers who are going to be very intimidating Furies.
I
Or,
hope so.
Right. So yeah, the whole orchestra will be basically this side of the room, and it's single strings, a string quartet, and also there's a great advantage in that they can be so supple to work with the singers in a way that's difficult to get a whole orchestra to do. So we've got.
So it's an even smaller orchestra,
Yes.
maybe, than if we would do
Exactly.
Orpheus and Eurydice.
Exactly, and I
over-
think it will be exactly right for this space. It'll just sound perfect in this space.
And let's see, the harp soloists, the flute soloists. There is a well-known flute solo in Orpheus and Eurydice, but it's not part of the Italian
Exactly.
version. I saw Jeff Barker's name, our principal flute player, Seattle
Yes.
Symphony. He's going to be involved.
Yes, and so there's going to be a moment near the end, we're going to feature Orpheus as the harp, and Eurydice's spirit, at least, as the flute, which will be kind of a
Can I
stunning
say
thing.
something about that? It's really, so this opera I only know from that music, from the flute solo,
From the Dance of the Blessed Spirits.
Yeah, Dance of the Blessed Spirit, because when I was younger, I played the flute, and it was part of the orchestral studies. You had, you learn the repertory
Yes.
and you play things, and so that was one of the ones, and I was kind of really fascinated by it as a teenager, and and then also there is the Balanchine Ballet. That has this incredible extended pas de deux that originally was Peter Martins and Suzanne Farrell. And, that was kind of a famous partnership that was quite remarkable. And to see them dance it, so that's always in my head. So the challenge is like, don't do that. Don't do that. But that solo is
That
flute
piece is
solo
probably
remarkable.
I would imagine the hit tune from this opera that made it into sort of popular consciousness is probably that piece. So it's I'm glad that we're going to have that because it is a very, very beautiful thing to listen to. But there's lots more super rich music. One thing about the musical incarnation of this opera that you're going to hear that we've never given you at Seattle Opera before is a countertenor Orpheus. And we have two countertenors making their debuts here at Seattle Opera, Christopher Ainsley and Kimon Murrah. I heard them both for the first time yesterday. Were you guys part of the question of, because when you do Orpheus and Eurydice, you have to figure out, okay, is it a mezzo? Are we doing it in French? Can we use a tenor? Are we going to, I have a recording with Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, baritone singing Orpheus in German, Orpheus und Eurydice. Really weird.
Jawohl.
Were
any of you involved in that, or did you?
No, that was already
find out about
underway
That's all Christina,
amongst the
I
artistic
think.
staff
Yep.
at the opera. They already were headed that direction.
But I love it.
Yeah, me too. And I just said, go for it.
The moment you
absolutely.
start hearing that's an out of the world sound that has its own magic, and it's supposed to represent young, and that yes, they're supposed to be young lovers, but there's something very magical, and what is happening to Orfeo is something very magical. So it just adds a level of. It's beautiful, actually.
Stephen, I wonder if I could get you to explain, particularly for those who are new to the opera, how that situation arises with the countertenor as an option.
The reason it's such an important subject for modern performances of operas from the 17th and 18th centuries is because the stars of the 17th and 18th century were largely the castrati, which we don't have any of.
Thank goodness.
And I don't think it's going to come back anytime soon. So the idea is that to have a male person singing the roles as written in the alto or soprano register. This happens to be more or less an alto or maybe mezzo-soprano register part. We have cultivated in our time the countertenor voice, but it was largely cultivated in boys' choirs, right? That was the origin of it. And early famous countertenors like Alfred Deller, do you remember Alfred Deller? That basically arose out of the boys' choir tradition. But then there came the question, what is a guy sounding like somebody from a boys' choir doing in an opera? And it doesn't always match. And so then there was another kind of countertenor, which was basically a kind of pseudo mezzo-soprano, which also is not completely satisfying, because then why don't you just get a mezzo-soprano? So there are, but in recent times, really over the last decade or two, there has arisen a whole class of, I would say, on a higher level, artists, countertenors, singing at a higher level, singing with all the virtuosity necessary for the opera, and not really modeled on either a boy's voice or a mezzo-soprano's voice. It's really become its own thing, and it's very gratifying for us who are doing this kind of music, because it can only be done with them.
Yeah. You know, the Julius Caesar in Atlanta, the Ptolomeo was a countertenor, and for me, just in 2 or 3 years from the last time I worked on a production with the quality of the voice was just so different.
Yeah.
It was fuller. It had all of the sounds that you get from because the female voices are just bigger, and this voice was big on this young man. I mean, it was really big, and it carried, but it retained many of the qualities that we associate with male singers, but having this, as Chía says, a kind of ethereal, otherworldly sound to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it important, the gender roles in this opera? We've been talking about particularly the situation with Eurydice having a smaller role, not really getting, in some of the versions, to say what's on her mind, being treated. But do they have to be male and female, or would the story work if...
I think love is love. So gender, for me, is not important in that sense. It could make it work both ways. I think the love and the love pain and the heartbroken and the trying to rescue your lover is way above gender. Yeah. So for me, no, it makes no difference. And Amore, we're going for as genderless as we can get, because again, no gender.
The god of love.
In love, gender doesn't matter. It's
love.
just there.
Yeah. It's
So
I think it's so. I love that. I remember my first experience of Baroque opera was again when I was in my early 20s, and so the realizations were all Raymond Lepard for the most part that we were hearing, and there was a recording of what's her name?
Was it Dame Janet?
It was Dame Janet. The Callisto that kind of blew my head off. But it was a Pompeia with what's it? Kathy Barbarian.
Yes, indeed.
And I can't remember who the other singer were, and these two female voices. Mm-hmm. It was the most sensuous thing I'd ever heard. Is that love duet, and it did. Yeah, it was like that. It was kind of like that, when just the way their voices kind of blended and matched, and and so I think that I mean, in some ways, I think with these operas that. It actually reinforces this idea that love is love, and that love transcends gender. That's one kind of love, or one way that love manifests itself. But also it can mix and match.
Well, and love and lust, as you say, being this sort of, in Italian they just have the word amor, and it has to sort of,
does all of it?
Serve multiple purposes, and you wouldn't sort them out necessarily in the thinking. And certainly this music, I mean, a lot of the music you do,
but
Stephen.
just that in Italian is like in Spanish, love, amor is saved for love. Like we don't love pants, we don't love a dish. because you have other words for that. So I think the word love, it's
For love.
for love.
Well, you know, there was
I like
something.
my pants. I am in love with your sushi socks.
Socks, my sushi socks. Yeah.
But I'm not really in love. Like I think those are really cool.
Well, I know I read something today, and it says there are these other words that we need to cultivate that mean love that we don't use anymore. Love becomes the default word to describe these things, you know. Like they were talking about people, we call everybody our friend, and everybody's not our friend. We have different, so we should, you know, cultivate the use of other words to describe our relationships with people.
I mean, it's interesting when you read this libretto how many synonyms they have to say my love, my beloved, my soul, my idol, my, you know, my breath. I mean, it's very, very rich.
I think the thing about with the one word where it's love and lust or suggest that I think it what's the language we use this day? It doesn't privilege kind of high-minded love over a physical love. And I think that sometimes, with our kind of Puritan backgrounds, that we sometimes we are kind of like this about things that have to do with the body, love that is represented purely through, or unpurely, through a physical attraction.
Mm-hmm. But that's sad. I mean, and then you go back to Orfeo and Eurydice, they're young. They don't know. They don't censor each other. And the first love we have, before we know that we're falling in love, it's chemistry. It's your body is waking up. It's hormones. It's everything but your brain.
Everything but your brain.
You don't know.
Yeah.
You have no idea. You're just going blindly.
Yeah.
You know, and you don't know. You don't have to know the word for it to feel it. So, and that's, I mean, that it's just, I guess there's different kind of loves.
There's different kinds of love. I mean, it's like Romeo and Juliet. I always say, if they waited a couple of months,
There'd be no story.
there'd be no story.
No
right.
story. Absolutely. Well, I mean, is there a backstory? I guess this is my question. Orpheus has this magical voice. Maybe having a countertenor Orpheus makes it a little bit more, you know, read a little bit more strongly. I mean, did she fall in love with him because of his voice? What's the role? I mean, so there was a brand new opera. They're doing it at the Metropolitan Opera, Eurydice of Matthew O'Coin, just called Eurydice, with a libretto by Sarah Rule. Right. And it's sort of a three-way relationship because there's Orpheus, Eurydice, and his voice, who's a countertenor, who is music personified or whatever. Right. And he was costumed just like Orpheus, and is kind of a rival for I mean, Eurydice certainly perceives there's this other thing in his life. But I don't know if you guys.
It's no accident that this particular myth, the Orphic myth, has been such a moving force in the whole history of opera. I mean, up until today, as you're saying, but particularly, you know, both Monteverdi's Orfeo and the two Eurydices that preceded it, which were the very earliest operas, up to this opera of Gluck, which was at a big turning point for opera, and today again. I think there's no accident about why the myth was chosen. It's because opera as a genre has one basic problem to overcome, which is, you know, verisimilitude. Like, why are they singing? Why aren't they just talking to each other like you would do in a normal theater? And to overcome that problem, by making a sort of semi-god of music, the central character, and his entourage as the nymphs and shepherds of Arcadia, they could plausibly all be singing to each other. I mean, it is kind of a suspension of disbelief, but it's a plausibility question. And I think that's why he keeps recurring. And also because it represents the power of music to move the emotions. And so in every way, he's made for opera, and opera's made for him.
This is why you composer types are always drawn to this story, is this, you know, this musician with magical powers. It does occur to me it would be a little awkward to make a movie version. I don't know if anybody's, I guess Cocteau's made a movie, but does he sing in those? It's been a while since I've watched them. Because it would have to be a movie musical, because Orpheus would constantly breaking into song.
There's Black Orpheus, but there's not.
So they dubbed, somebody else did the singing. And
Yeah,
sort of,
but the Cocteau is a pure play, and the play of the cinematography is the main magic there, not the voice. Yeah.
But the mother puts the baby to sleep by humming and singing, not by talking to the baby.
Yes, that's right.
So we are tied to singing.
Oh yes.
And to
It's like
rhythm.
Exactly, and it's like that's the first thing we do.
Well, it's like your thing in this. You said they pick up the rhythm
Yeah.
of Orpheus.
I would ask the other question: when did we quit singing and start talking?
that we start by saying, and actually, little children trying to figure out language start with pitch.
It's
generally.
pitched, yeah.
More often than they start with trying to get consonants.
Yeah, pitch.
Yep.
No. We've got a few minutes left of our program here. I could probably keep talking to these folks. Well, I get to keep talking to these folks for the next several weeks as we develop this. But we will have a chance, if you're watching us on YouTube Live, if you write in your question, we'll get it read out here, and maybe some of the folks in our live audience here want to think about some questions. I'm going to double check my list and see if I left anything. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I have one more important question for you guys. Why leave paradise to come back to this mortal vale of tears? If we go to this place and it's so beautiful, as your orchestra will indicate when we get to the Elysian Fields, and again, I don't know if there's going to be a dance component there, but it's a very pleasant place. Why should we leave?
Well, it's exactly the question that Eurydice poses. She says, "Why did you wake me up if you're not going to talk to me?"
And that's exactly the question Orfeo has to do at some point, is why am I taking her out of this paradise?
He doesn't have an answer.
No, he can't answer. He can't
he
answer.
does.
It's part of his oath. He can't answer.
Oh, he's promised.
He promised, yes, indeed. If he would answer, that's as bad as turning back, which he eventually does.
Questions from our crowd here? Anybody? Or have we got any questions coming in on the Ayana? Do you have the YouTube up there?
It meant we talked very clearly.
Maybe we did. There's a lot of questions with. I mean, Orpheus just keeps changing. I mean, I thought that new opera would be the last one, and then I opened the paper today, and there was a new Eurydice poem that I hadn't ever seen before. I mean, it's not just the musicians, but the poets. Let's face it, the poets have been, and the painters have been completely fascinated by this story for, going back to the sort of mosaic tiles on Roman floors. I mean, it's a very compelling story for artists. And has been. Yes, we got a question over here. And actually, can we get a microphone so that the folks who are watching us online can hear the question?
Keep your mask on. Thank you.
Hello, this question is really for Chía. Thank you. But my name's John Boziet. When I go to the opera, I tend to allow the music and the story to carry me through the evening, no matter how much I know about the opera or not. I take that director's interpretation and let it go. With the experimentation that you've announced tonight, I'm not sure if I'm going to be led down an optimistic path or not. Perhaps you could just guide me a little bit on that.
I promise you that it will be optimistic. And I absolutely respects the music. As I said, I actually really, really respect the music. I think I do. But it is a different take. It's exactly wondering, and it's this last question of, if you know what's best for the one you love, do you do that which is best for the one you love, or that is best for you? And for me, the best Orfeo is the one that chooses what's best for Eurydice. And that's the best possible Orfeo that I would fall in love with that Orfeo. And I think I need to fall in love with Orfeo because he cares so much for Eurydice that he takes care of her. And there's Orfeo's story, there's a zillion ways to interpret. That's the way I interpret in such a way that me would fall in love with Orfeo. Not because he has a voice, that's not even his doing. That's a gift of the gods. That's not, he can't even be proud of that because That's his luck. It's just like talent. Sometimes, as much as a singer is born with that voice, then they have the discipline, the talent, the work, the luck, a zillion ways, you know. But sometimes people are touched by gods. That's not our gift, you know, what we do with it. So Orfeo cannot be proud of his voice. He can be thankful he had Eurydice. He can be sad to the end because he lost her. But then he finally has the chance to make a choice and take a decision. And then does he choose what is good for him, or does he choose what is good for Eurydice? And I need to know that he loves her so much that he chooses what is good for her. And I find that very redeeming, and for me that's an incredibly optimistic, loveful, tender story. So that's the story I'm trying to tell.
I think one of the things that puzzles me about the story is that with the strictures on Orpheus' behavior, you can do this, you can't do that, it becomes his story because it's his struggle. And we've been talking about giving Eurydice more of a voice. How do you balance that?
It's actually in the music. Mm-hmm. He has pauses in the right places where people have that time. You know, sometimes if you take a second to listen, then you have a pause, and there are breaks, and there are changes of it goes from like diminish, and then it goes to a minor, and that makes you melt, or that makes you hurt. So it actually, I think Gluck has written everything in the score, if we take the time to listen. You know, if we don't take the time to listen, then many times, then you just nag, or you just go, or you attack because you like, don't think it, that's the way. But right now, we've had 2 years to think about it, 2 years to listen. And so I think we can ask new questions, you know?
And I'd just like to reinforce that point. It's not just the audience or the artist taking the time to listen to what Gluck has to say. It's also really reinforcing that the singers are going to do what Gluck has to say. I mean, that's what I feel my job as a conductor is to be the representative of the composer who's not around to represent himself. And Gluck's intentions, it seems to me, are extremely clear. Like you're saying, it's that everything is really in the score if you take the time to bring it out. And that's what we've been doing for the last 2 days with our singers. And my feeling is we're very lucky that they're so responsive to those clues that Gluck has left us.
I think actually we have run away from our feelings. The score is very delicate. And now we feel, every silence we feel with noise. We turn the TV on, you know, we wake up and you turn the radio. People are so uncomfortable with silence, but it is in the silence that we really can listen. And today when we did the end, it was like, it is what you said. For me, the most beautiful sound of the voice is that pianissimo down to niente, where that touches, the angels touch that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? But we're not giving ourselves the time to listen to that. But in this one, we will. I mean, this is intimate space. The idea of it surrounding them is like we can actually feel. That's a gift, because I think the world is telling us not to feel. It's way easier for them to tell us how to move if we don't feel. So for me, the important thing of art is to allow us to feel again. And for that, sometimes silence is the perfect thing. And in that sense, if you listen to the silence, if you don't get nervous in the silence, if you just feel it, then it talks to you.
Beautifully put, Chía. I was going to ask you, maybe not what kind of homework do people need to do, but what kind of headspace do people need to be in to come to this production of Orpheus and Eurydice? What would you like the audience to bring to the experience?
What I love about theater, and because many times I directed the National Theater before in Ecuador, and I've learned that in a theater, because it's dark, because you feel safe, because you feel like nothing is going to happen, people take their walls down, you know, and I find that a gift, you know. It's like, and it doesn't happen with entertainment, but entertainment sometimes is just fun. But if people put themselves into a vulnerable place, you're not looking around to see what is everybody feeling. You just allow yourself to feel. So if people allow themselves to be vulnerable, then they climb on the music and start writing it. You know, it's just like, that's the magic of theater. And now that we have like, movies do that, and it's funny because movies are doing their best to try to be a theater, and they sell you as an experience. Come and see 3D theater. It's like, well, the theater is 3D. You know, and it's really funny, and people pay more money for more glasses and more tickets and IMAX. It's like, imagine like real life size. I was like, well, the theater is real life size. So it's funny that we've forgotten that the theater has magic. And this is the place where you will see it live, not in movie, in a theater, you see it live. And every single performance is completely different because, as I said, the audience affects the performers. So if there is a receptive audience, the performers connect to the audience. And there is a symbiosis here where people are sharing. That is like, performer, it's a circular thing. And that only happens in theaters, not anywhere else.
I think we have a question up at the top from somebody online. And
Yeah.
Ayana, do you have a microphone?
Yes, yeah. Someone said, I love the changes made to the ending of the opera. Should we start learning to be more flexible with making cuts or changes to score with other operas? Or, for example, to change parts of traditional operas that are offensive or outdated?
That's a slippery slope, isn't it? I mean,
It's a big question, and
it's
there
a
may
big
be multiple
question. I mean,
questions in there.
I was on a different panel with Donald recently, and he said something I thought was very wise. He said that's like presuming there's something to fix, and I think that's not the presumption we should have. We should presume that the work of art from any other time has something to tell us, not something for us to fix and make it sort of more politically acceptable to our time. But that's anyway not what we're doing. We're not trying to make Gluck acceptable to our time. We're just trying to tell the story in the most cohesive way we can, and it just seemed to Chía, and then on reflection, after I thought about it, I thought, yes, not having the fanfare-ish sort of beginning and the triumphant ending, it's like now we just have the actual story, and it feels kind of more real to me.
I think, I mean, what Stephen just said was so great. That other panel, I think about it differently. I mean, my sentiments are the same, but we're not, the artists in the past don't need to be woke. You know, they are who they are. They were their time. If there are problematic issues that people find with it, we just create a context for the modern audience to understand. We don't try to fix it in the art. It is what it is.
Well, it sounds like that's, I mean, going back to this conversation we were having here about object of my love, that if Orpheus's love is something that objectifies Eurydice, that's part of the show. I mean, those words are in there, but maybe there's a perspective that we can have a little bit more distance from that and say, you know, he needs to grow up a little bit and understand there's more to love than, you know, just having a pretty thing to put on his fireplace mantle.
He does grow up in our version, isn't that
Very
true?
much.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
In our version, actually, he changes a lot. He grows. I would say to our friend asking over in the other side of the screen, that any piece of art, you can look at it from many different directions. Even a painting, you know, it's like a kid will describe it completely different than a teenager, than an adult. I don't think we're trying to fix it or change it. We're just taking a different look. But we are literally using what Gluck has on the page. We actually, yes, but as I said, it's like the ending, it wasn't Gluck's idea. It was imposed to him, you know, and the cohesive of the story is right there. So I think Gluck will be pretty happy with this and thinking, and not saying this is the right way, but it's like, I like it. I also, again, I train as a composer. I always love to hear the different performers interpret in different ways. And I actually had discussions with my teachers, and I even lost a composition once because they said, you need to put the tempo at the beginning. I had something like agitato, I don't even remember. And they said, no, quarter note equal how much is like whatever they interpret that is agitato. No, you need to put a tempo. It's like, no, I don't need to put a tempo. And I made it to the finals. It was a university competition. Well, if you don't put a tempo, you're not gonna go. It's just like, then I don't go. You know, it's like people, what agitato means for one violinist is going to be different than for whatever happens inside.
It's an emotion.
It's an emotion, and I
Not
can't say that's the right one, you know.
scientific,
And even
yeah.
the next day might be different. So I think that's the beauty of art. You can look at it from many sides.
I just, the thing about the endings and the beginnings and those are commercial considerations. Even at that time, that was how are we going to get people to come in and see this and be excited by it so we can sell tickets, so we can build our reputation or get our pocketbooks full. So, I think one has to, understand that sometimes the choices are pragmatic and are operating a certain way, and so I think or there for a particular reason, certain things, and so the question is, when a modern person, contemporary person looks at it, well, we understand that that's what they were doing, but what was the artist's intention, not the producer or the other people around them, what they wanted to. So we strip that stuff away, and this is what we believe that the artist really intended. And also, I think using work that they did later, or we understand better their sensibility, and can go back to earlier work to say, okay.
I love the fact that this company is trusting us. As we're talking about, we're trying this and we're thinking this. That's also a gift. I think people are so afraid of taking risks right now that you just go for the safety. Yeah. And we're talking here, and I sure hope it works, and I have faith in what we're doing, but it is new.
It's the risk. And we've never done an opera like this in this space. This is experimental in some ways.
So, but that's a gift. Yeah. That's a gift that we're allowed to try something new. That right there is a gift.
Well, it's a gift to us that we have such sincere artists who are open to this and are in a sort of a wonderful way egging each other on to new ideas and new ways of thinking. Stephen Stubbs, Chía Patiño, and Donald Byrd, thanks so much for being with us for this program today. Thank you all for being here. Our event this evening was recorded and will eventually go on Seattle Opera's YouTube channel, maybe a little while. We'll also probably post the audio on our podcast channel, and stay tuned to Seattle Opera for more stuff coming out. Orpheus and Eurydice opens January the 12th. 17 performances. You got to hear both countertenors because they're both. Each one is better than the other, and it's
really great.
A really, really exciting cast across the board, and just looking forward to it. Thank you all for being here with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello.